For nearly 2 years, I have pestered Hyundai Sime Derby to take out the Palisade. Simply because it's not that this is a car that people don't want to buy, it's just that a lot of people aren't really aware that it's for sale. And it's largely down to the fact that they don't really market the car, it's not really all that visible, and of course the media have not really been given the opportunity to drive it. Until today. My name is ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, this is our review of the Hyundai Palisade. In Malaysia, the Hyundai Palisade is available as either a 6-seater or a 7-seater, and both models are available with two different engines. So first, on the seating configurations, you can either have this as a 2-2-2 configuration with two captain's chairs in the back, like we have on this car, or you can have a bench seat in the second row to expand that to 7 seats. Now, in terms of engine options, you can either get this with a Lambda 3.8-litre V6 petrol engine with power going to the front wheels via an 8-speed automatic gearbox. Alternatively, there is also a 2.2-litre CRDI turbo diesel, which puts power to all 4 wheels via the same 8-speed automatic box. But of course, when we talk about the Palisade, I think the major selling point is actually this car's looks. Now, the Palisade was actually designed for North America, and so there it competes with the standard wheelbase size vehicles like the Cadillac Escalade, the GMC Yukon, and so you do need to have this very brash, very bold front end. Now, the model that we have here is the facelift, which is why, for example, you see the extension of that grille all the way up here where you actually find the indicators hiding on this side. You also get this lovely dark chrome trim up front, which also includes the Hyundai badging. The daytime running lights have also been repositioned, where they used to come inward into the bumper. They now sit towards the furthest edge, although they still go from the top of the fender all the way to the bottom, which I think make this car look very distinctive indeed. Talking about lighting, up front you will get full LED headlights replete with LED high beams, and while this is a daytime running light, this also doubles up as the positioning lights, which means that at night you still maintain this same LED light signature. As we move further down the side, you will get a set of 20-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Bridgestone Dweller HP tires. Now, these are high-performance sport tires, although obviously performance is not really the name of the game here, because the priority here is ultimately ensuring that this car has adequate grip to deal with this car's diesel performance. And so far, so good. But it's actually the side profile of the Hyundai Palisade which I think makes it look incredibly distinctive. This is an E-segment SUV, one of very few available in Malaysia, which is why it is as large as it is. Now, as we move further down the side, you have decently sized door mirrors, the importance of which I will detail a little bit later. But what I do appreciate is the use of this satin chrome material to sort of break up the monotony of the bodywork, which is available not only around the windows but also down there, again, to sort of visually break it up. However, because this car is white, it also outlines something about Hyundai models that I really do not like, and that is this button-style lock and unlock system. There is something about the Koreans that insist that this is the best way to lock and unlock a car when you have a keyless entry system. I don't understand why they just don't go with an induction sort of sensor back here the way everybody else has, but whatever. As we move further down the side, again, because this car is so massive, that's also why you have a very large window back here, which is important once you get inside. Now, the back end of the Palisade, I think, looks quite neat, given the fact this is ultimately a large SUV. I think it does look quite sharp. So on either side, you get full LED tail lights, replete with LED brake lights and indicators. Now, I point this out because when this car was initially refreshed, HSDM pointed out the fact that if you get the diesel, these tail lights were done up with bulbs, but it seems that at some point in the last 2 years, they've updated the specifications. So now all Palisades get LED tail lights. Now, if you're wondering, the reverse lights and the fog lights actually live down on this strip, which I think is quite neat. And because this is the diesel, that's why you get dual exhaust tips on this side. If you get the V6, they are on either side. Of course, you can also tell by the H-Track badging here and the 2.2-litre diesel badging here, because only the diesel comes with all-wheel drive. Now, the benefit of having a vehicle this big is actually in terms of practicality. With the third row down, as you can see, this car is absolutely massive. I could actually sleep diagonally across this if I wanted to cheap out on a hotel. On top of that, You can also fold the second row from a pair of buttons here. There's also a 12-volt socket should you want it. And on top of that, there's also a parcel shelf which lives neatly underneath the boot floor, which means that if you want to deploy the third row, you can hide your parcel shelf, and you want to put it down, you can put this parcel shelf in place and keep all of your valuable items out of sight. Now, as I'm sat here, I would like to point out the fact the Palisade uses a very rudimentary shock and coil system. There's no air suspension on this car, which means you cannot lower the load height in order to take things in and out a little bit easier. But that also should mean that long-term durability is improved by using a slightly more traditional system. Now, all of that exterior bulk translates to this cabin, because from the moment you step in, you realize that this is an absolutely enormous car. Now, highlighting those things are things like the dashboard architecture, where you have a lot of these horizontal materials and horizontal lines in order to draw the eye and make this car feel a lot wider and a lot more expansive, which is certainly nice to see when you're sat in this seat. On top of that, things like the center console area, for example, is so incredibly wide that, again, it highlights that this is a very large car. Now, before we get into stuff like this, let's first talk about the technology. Now, up front, you get a very large, wide center screen replete with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, albeit wired. But admittedly, this is a very easy system to use. The user interface is relatively intuitive, and nothing is ever too hidden within the menus, except for maybe some of the car settings. On top of that, a lot of the functionality that lives in here are things that you won't use very often, because all the things that you do use often, like the HVAC controls, etc., live down here. Now, up ahead of me, I'll also find a digital instrument cluster, which is very typical of what we've seen from Hyundai and Kia. All of the information is displayed in a very logical manner. It's not the most customizable screen in the world, but it does work very well as an instrument cluster, which I appreciate enormously. Now, up ahead of that sits a full color heads-up display, which shows you pertinent information like your ADAS functionalities, your blind spot indicators, as well as your speed. Unfortunately, you cannot get navigational instructions on that screen. You'll have to be reliant on your Android Auto within this central screen. Now, as we move further down, that's where you get a bank of physical buttons, which is, again, always nice to see. There are a row of shortcut buttons here in order to access the majority of quick use functions within that screen, and then below that sits the HVAC controls. This car comes with quad zone climate control, where this panel here can control not only the front climate but also the rear, which means that nothing is ever more than a button press away. Moving further down, you get your trigger button for your reverse camera, as well as your parking sensors, your hill descent control, as well as your electronic gear selector that lives here. Beneath that sit a set of buttons to control your heated and ventilated front seats, as well as your heated steering wheel, which may not seem like a useful function, but on a long drive with the air conditioning pointed directly at your hands, it is actually nice to hold a slightly warmer steering wheel. Now, there is another wheel up here, which is a little bit more important. This is your drive and terrain mode selector. So when you're driving it, for the majority of the time you can choose between Comfort, Eco, Sport, and Smart. Smart is actually a system where it figures out which mode you need based on steering and throttle inputs, and it adapts the car to that. Press this button and you access the terrain mode functions. Because the diesel Palisade comes with an H-track all-wheel drive system that also gives it things like snow, mud, and sand modes should you actually want to take your E-segment SUV off-road. Not that anybody's doing that. Now, beyond that, you get this expansive plastic, but with the press of a button, it reveals a couple of cup holders as well as a wireless charging pad for your phone. You get a USB-A port here, and this is what controls your Android Auto and Apple CarPlay functionality. Further beyond that, you get a 12-volt socket back here, as well as a USB-C port in a relatively large center tunnel. And there's also even this small removable storage you can take in and out and put here should you want to have smaller items. But this is a plastic panel, which means that if you put keys in it, it is going to rattle. Now, because there's an electronic gear selector, that means that this floating center console reveals even more space underneath, where again you get another 12-volt socket and some USB ports. You have a very large glove box here, which holds the owner's manual, which I'm taking out simply because this binder is actually of a very nice quality. You get very large door bins, big enough for a 1.5 litre size bottle. There's even more space behind that. There are also cubby holes up here large enough to hold a phone, and these are rubberized, which means that things in here are not going to rattle. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these front seats are both heated and ventilated, as well as powered with 2-stage memory for the driver. The steering wheel is also decently adjustable, which means it's quite easy to get a comfortable driving position. And overall, the ergonomics in this car are quite good. There is only one thing in this car that I'm really not a fan of, and that's the fact that those full LED headlights that you saw up front still have manual leveling, which is kind of ridiculous for nearly 400,000 ringgit. Now, because this is an E-segment SUV with an especially long wheelbase, naturally space in the second row is not an issue. I'm about 170 centimeters. With the front seat set up in my driving position, I have acres of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom despite the standard fit second sunroof, which is always nice to see. On top of that, the amount of amenities back here are also pretty good. These seats, although they are manual, are still heated and ventilated. I get my own air conditioning controls here, and I made a mistake earlier. This is a 3-zone climate control system, but although the buttons live here, you may be wondering where the air conditioning vents are. They are on the ceiling, which I think is an ideal placement for a vehicle like this. On top of that, Hyundai has this wonderful sort of diffuse air conditioning system where instead of having vents that are pointed directly at your face, you can set it so that it blows sort of ambiently, so it cools the back end without having it blow in a specific direction, which is always nice to see. And of course, when you're manipulating these aircon vents, and that's also when you notice this car's Alcantara roof lining, which is so incredibly soft, and it speaks to the luxury appeal of the Hyundai Palisade. Now, there are also some amenities back here. For example, you get USB-C ports on the backs of the front seats, as well as a single 12-volt 180-watt socket in the middle. These seats can also be slid fore and aft should you want to make more space for the second row. You can also recline these seats to quite a ridiculous degree should you so want to, I don't know, take a nap. Now, if you are traveling over longer distances, you will appreciate the fact that, number one, you have the powered sunshade for this sunroof should you want it. You also have sun blinds here in order to keep things private, or if you have young children in the ISOFIX mounted child seats back here, you'll appreciate that this blocks out a little bit more of those UV rays. Now, some of you may have noticed in this particular shot that it looks like there isn't that many cubby holes, but that's just because of the angle. You get a couple of cup holders up here. Yes, I mean 2 on each door. You get really large door bins, big enough for a litre-sized bottle. You've got very large pockets on the backs of the seats, as well as these very small pockets on the side of the second row seats to hold smaller items. On top of that, because this car is as massive as it is, you also have a decently sized space here in order to access the third row should you not want to tumble the second row seats, like if you have a child seat, for example. And because of this car's very long wheelbase, even if you have a bulky rear-facing child seat, which shouldn't be any issue to get into the car because these doors are massive and open wide, it should also have enough clearance as not to brush the backs of the front seats, which means that you have a little bit more practicality. Also, you would have noticed that this car comes with a burgundy leather interior. There are actually 3 interior upholstery options for this car, that being this lovely burgundy, as well as a light tan and a black leather interior. All cars get Napa leather as standard, but it also changes the material choice on these panels as well as on the center stack. So if you get a white colored interior, for example, then all of that becomes wood. If you get a black one, I suspect it's shared with this, and of course with burgundy you get, well, this, because that's what this car has. And overall, the Palisade, given its size and given the price, does offer a pretty practical package, and that extends into the third row. Now, at the very beginning of this video, I made a mistake with regards to the seating arrangements, because I said this car is available as either a 6 or 7-seater. As it turns out, Hyundai thinks you can put 3 people back here, which makes this either a 7 or 8-seater, although that's only if the people back here are very, very narrow. Now, with the second row seat set up the way I was sat earlier, I actually have about that much knee room, and I have a pretty okay amount of headroom because the bump for the retractable second row sun blind for the sunshade actually hides in a bump that ends about here. So in terms of where my head is, I actually have pretty alright headroom. On top of that, even though these seats are mounted quite low, so I don't have much in terms of under-thigh support, I still get my own air conditioning vents, I get USB-C ports, and a couple of cup holders back here as well. The recline angle for these seats can also be adjusted, which means that I can sit a little bit more relaxed or I can sit a little bit more upright should I so want to, which means life in the third row is really not that bad. That is obviously the benefit of having a vehicle this big, although if you are using the third row on a regular basis, you may benefit slightly from a large MPV like the Kia Carnival instead of a large SUV like this. But that said, again, it's really not that bad. I have a good view out because of the large windows that I mentioned earlier. It's still quite practical, and because there's still quite a lot of space in the boot, even with the third row up, it does mean that, for example, a family holiday shouldn't be an issue at all. And because this is the 7-seater, it does mean that if you do have passengers in the back here, they could use that space between the front seats to stretch out a little, which I think might be very useful if you're stuck in the car for several hours at a time. Now, the thing about the Palisade or Hyundai in general is that they are trying to move a little bit more upmarket, and the Palisade is ultimately the flagship internal combustion vehicle currently available in Malaysia. As a result, that sets very high expectations for what this car is like to drive. Now, the thing about the Palisade is that this is a full-size luxury SUV, or at least that's what Hyundai claims it to be in terms of the luxury part. So as we mentioned earlier, the vehicle that we're driving has a 2.2-litre turbo diesel. Now this car is also available with a petrol V6, but I actually think that it's this turbo diesel that's really the choice in the lineup. Firstly, because unlike the petrol, this powertrain doesn't consume a conspicuous amount of fuel. For example, on several motorway runs, both with and without traffic, this car returns less than 8 litres to the 100 on those particular trips. And in fact, over the last 400, almost 500 kilometers that we've done in this car, it's still doing an average of 8.8 litres to the 100, which I think is still a pretty good figure given the sheer size of this car and of course the mass it carries with it, despite the amount of torque that this car produces, or this powertrain produces. Obviously, if you're to get the V6, the engine has to rev harder in order to achieve its torque peak, which means you will end up consuming more fuel, which is why, like I said, this is the pick of the bunch. On top of that, although some of you may argue that because it's a diesel, you are giving up something in terms of refinement, I actually disagree. Now, I'd like to point out, or I'd like to take this opportunity to point out, that this 2.2-litre turbo diesel may seem similar to the one that you get in the Kia Carnival, but that is a SmartStream D engine, which is a slightly more advanced, slightly newer diesel or turbo diesel mill from Hyundai Kia, whereas this is the CRDI engine, which unfortunately is from a slightly older family of engines, which means that this actually has more in common with the Hyundai Starex as opposed to the Kia Carnival. Now, what that means is it is slightly less refined than the one that you get in the Carnival. However, Hyundai has gotten over that by making the rest of the car a lot more refined. So obviously the Palisade is a slightly larger vehicle compared to the Carnival, and it has a slightly bigger dash-to-axle ratio. This is important because it means that the engine is actually mounted further away from the cabin than it would be in the Carnival, or in fact even in a Hyundai Staria, although that also uses a CRDI engine rather than the new SmartStream D. As a result, there is a lot more in terms of noise suppression material between the engine and the cabin, which means that when you're sat here, you don't really hear much of it. And then of course there is the refinement in terms of the engine operation itself. Now I can say that at idle this is actually more refined than you would expect from the Kia Carnival, if that's where your expectations are set. Again, this is largely due to the fact that Hyundai has done a lot in order to isolate the powertrain from the cabin, and so again this feels like a much more refined vehicle even though it's using a slightly older engine technology. Now what that means is that ultimately in this car you might hear a little bit of the engine, especially when you're on the throttle and you're starting from zero. But otherwise, there's not really much of it in this cabin. It doesn't really make its presence known. It's not a particularly noteworthy or particularly obvious character in the play that this car puts forward, which means, again, you're getting the benefits of improved fuel economy without really much of the detriment. And it's not unless you absolutely stand on the throttle will you actually notice this engine when you're on the move. And because this is a turbo diesel, it means that you're not really going to be standing on the throttle very often anyway. Because this car's masses of torque arrive from very low down, there's never really a need for you to really rev out the engine. And because this car uses a very adept 8-speed automatic gearbox, at no point in daily operation does the engine speed have to really exceed 2000 RPM, which means that this remains a very refined place to be. But of course, I've spoken a lot about how this car drives at slow speeds. I think you might now be concerned what this car is like at higher speeds, because ultimately this car is very bluff. You know, it's got tall sides, it's got a very flat front, so you may be concerned as to how high-speed refinement might be. Now, even though this car runs on very middle-of-the-road Bridgestone Dweller tires, and even though this car is designed the way it is, it's actually really refined. The Hyundai Palisade benefits from having acoustic glass all the way around the cabin. So that means it's dual laminated glass with a film of plastic between two panes of glass. This helps to insulate the cabin from outside noise. And as a result, wind noise in this car is very, very well suppressed. And again, despite that very middle of the road, not particularly high performance tire, the ones that come standard with this car, road noise is also very well suppressed, no doubt by the extensive use of noise suppression material in order to ensure that fewer noises intrude into the cabin. This is all towards Hyundai creating a much more luxurious experience behind the wheel, or in fact within the cabin of the Palisade, which makes sense given that this is ultimately their flagship vehicle. And I can say as I go through this tunnel, because unfortunately it's 9 o'clock in the morning so I can't demonstrate this to you, but I can say with confidence that when you do drive this car north of the national speed limit, this car remains incredibly refined, far more refined than an Alphard or Velfire, or in fact other vehicles kind of sort of within this space. The Mazda CX-9, for example, which kind of sort of competes with this, is a little bit faster to get up to speed owing to its 2.5-litre turbocharged petrol engine, but once you get there, it doesn't quite isolate as well as this car does. And that also extends to the ride, because Mazdas are also known for providing some degree of driving dynamics, and the CX-9 admittedly drives very, very well for a vehicle of that size. The Palisade, on the other hand, very confidently says that driving dynamics is not its bag. That is not the point. Instead, this car is entirely about comfort, but it does so in a way that speaks to a company, or speaks of a company that's been making cars for a very long time. So for example, the primary ride in this car, which is what happens when you first hit a bump, is very well tuned in the sense that it isolates the cabin from the very worst lumps and bumps that life throws at it. But it's the secondary ride that I find most impressive, because rather than erring on the side of comfort the way a lot of Chinese car makers do, where the secondary ride also remains very soft, and that results in a car that takes a long time to settle down after it's been unsettled by road imperfections, the secondary ride in this car is a little bit more confident, which means that the rebound rate, I know I'm getting very technical here, but the rebound rate in this car is very well damped, so at no point does it feel like the car is outside or beyond the control of the driver. Now what this means is when you do drive long distance, you can do so very confidently knowing that your car feels stable and it feels planted. But what that also means is when you are cruising on the motorway at motorway speeds, when you encounter a corner, you don't have to scrub a whole bunch of speed in order to keep things sort of tidy behind the wheel and within the cabin. That, to me, says that this is a car that you really can use for more things. It is a car that you can drive in town, it's a car that you can drive on the motorway, it is a car that drives with a degree of confidence that you just wouldn't expect, or wouldn't necessarily expect from something this large. Now I keep bringing up the size because this car is massive, and that becomes very evident when you're trying to drive in town. Because not only is this car very big, it also doesn't come with a 360 camera as standard. Now, Hyundai Sime Darby says that you can add a 360 cam should you want to, but it is at additional cost, which means that it is some figure above the 370-odd thousand ringgit that this car presently commands, which to me feels a little bit cheap. I do think that standard features like a 360 camera, or rather features like a 360 cam, should be offered as standard, particularly at this price point. And that's even before you consider that competitors like the Volvo XC90 and the BMW X5 and the Mercedes-Benz GLE to some extent all offer fantastic 360 cams as standard. And so the lack of 360 cam does mean that when you are driving in particularly tighter conditions, for example, older shopping centers with very tight car parks, that's going to be a bit of trouble. In fact, when I drove this car into the Sheraton PJ, that was a particularly hair-raising experience because the ramps there are quite narrow. And this is not a narrow car by any measure. Now, of course, there are also going to be many of you who will be using your Palisade as more than just a vehicle that you drive yourself. In fact, quite a number of Palisade customers in Malaysia use them as chauffeur cars, and that's because life in the second row is just as good. When you get them with the pilot seats like this car has, for example, that means you get ventilated, heated second row seats with air conditioning vents and your own climate zone, which means that life in here is very comfortable and it does feel quite indulgent. And so to that end, maneuverability in tight spaces isn't really your concern anymore, but I'd like to think that the people who watch this channel, a lot of you drive your own cars, and so this is something that might concern you. Now, in terms of the overall experience in the Palisade, I do think that it is quite positive, and this is also aided by the fact that the Palisade now comes as standard regardless of which variant you go for, with a full suite of active safety features as currently made available by Hyundai. Which means that not only do you get things like autonomous emergency braking with pedestrian and cyclist detection, it also means that you enjoy things like lane keep and lane tracing assist, you get lane departure warning, you get blind spot monitoring, you get rear cross traffic alert, even though this car doesn't come with a 360 cam. And the adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, especially in this car, is very, very polished. It maintains a very realistic distance between you and the vehicle in front of you, and it manages the speed in terms of braking and speeding up in a very natural fashion, which means that it is a system that ultimately you can rely on more situations or in more situations. So I do think that this car presents a very polished package, not only as a large family car, but also as a chauffeur vehicle, one that you are driven in or one that you drive yourself. There are only two things in this scenario that I'm not a big fan of. Number one is the choice of trim material in this car. And that is because a lot of the trim in here is just not quite up to scratch. It's not quite what I'd expect for this price point. So for example, because we have the burgundy leather interior, that means that we get this sort of metallic-y textured kind of weird plasticky thing all over the place. And it's a matte finish. Now, I understand why it's a matte finish, because in the center console especially, you do not want it to be reflective when you're driving. It's just that it just doesn't feel quite as nice as I'd want for a car that is knocking on 400,000 ringgit. However, if you do get this car with the light interior, then you also get this sort of wood-like material to cover all of these panels, and that does improve things significantly. And I think the black interior also comes with this material, I'm not that sure. But if it does, don't get the black. The next issue actually has to do with the warranty. So for 370 odd thousand ringgit, the Palisade comes as standard with a 2-year warranty. Now, this is because, according to Hyundai Sime Darby, a lot of people who purchase these cars purchase them as company cars, and company cars get refreshed every 2 years, and so they only need the warranty to cover that period when it is being used in the company fleet. That makes sense. It's just that as a private customer, you might be more inclined to have a vehicle with a slightly more comprehensive warranty package, which means you are going to be spending more on top of that. Now, if you want a full 5 years, Hyundai Sime Darby will sell that to you, and it will come with a 5-year service package, which means that ultimately you're not really paying anything more out of pocket. But the fact that it is additional cost means that even if you get the most affordable variant, ultimately you are going to end up paying about 400,000 ringgit. Now, if you were to compare this car to other vehicles within the segment, if you're going to be using your supersized SUV primarily in town, mostly as a chauffeur vehicle to go from home to work and work to home, then I would advise that you actually check out the Kia EV9, because that car being electric means that it's even more refined than this, particularly when you're stuck in traffic. And when you do need to cover longer distances, that car will comfortably do about 450 kilometers between stops, and because the 800 volt architecture, it means that it charges very quickly as well. However, if you're going to be using a vehicle like this to cart your family around, and you look at this as sort of an adventure vehicle, then I would also advise you looking, or considering at least, the Kia Carnival, because admittedly that is a little bit better at carrying adults, especially in the third row. This car does require some degree of compromise in order to achieve that SUV look. However, if you just need a large vehicle and you want something that speaks to a slightly more subtle tune of wealth, you don't really want the ostentatiousness of a BMW X5 or even the sort of recognition, brand recognition that you get from a Volvo XC90, then I would recommend the Hyundai Palisade. This has been an impressive car to drive. I do really like it. And if you were to compare it against a BMW X7 or a Mercedes-Benz GLS, well, then this also just makes financial sense. In any case, that concludes our review of the Hyundai Palisade 2.2 litre turbo diesel. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.